Hello, and yes, I'm finally at the front of the bike. Oh, how far we've come. About 4 feet. Anyway, I got to work removing the front brakes, starting with the master cylinder. After much deliberation, I decided on upgrading the system to a set of blue spots and master cylinder of an early R6. I'll be replacing the hoses too, as these are quite corroded. Then it was time to get the front wheel in the air. I picked up the front lift arm to go with my ABBA stand. Now, compared to some of my previous methods of lifting the front end of a bike up, this is 1,000 times easier and a bit safer. The steering head bearings feel fine, so a clean up and re-grease should be enough. Next, I got to work getting the wheel out. The mudguard came off easy enough, allowing me to have a good look at the state of the fork stanchions. They look pretty good, to be honest. Phew. I disconnected the hydraulic clutch line and removed the master cylinder. Next was the left-hand switchgear. Followed by the right-hand switchgear and throttle assembly. Then I removed the bar end weights, as I will be replacing the grips. I loosened the pinch bolts on the top yoke before cracking the fork caps. Then I loosened the pinch bolts on the bottom yoke. Snipped the cable ties, and finally removed the forks. I removed the clip-ons, as they'll get a good clean up too. Using a breaker bar, I cracked the steering stem nut, undid it and removed the top yoke. Then I removed the locking washer, the top lock nut, and finally removed the bottom nut with a C-spanner. Then off came the steering stem. Naturally, I gave the whole area a decent clean up with degreaser. While doing so, I noticed I was missing the rubber grommet from the left side of the frame, so I ordered a replacement. Much better. I checked the race on the top bearing and it was in great condition. Same on the bottom, things were looking pretty good for just re-greasing the bearings. I gave everything a good clean up with brake cleaner, getting all the old grease out of the bearings. The bottom yoke though was looking pretty rough, and I started to realise that it was going to need a bit more than just a scrub up with a toothbrush. Still not convinced, I decided to send it off for blasting and fresh powder coat, which of course meant removing the bottom bearing.
Approximately 10 hours later.
Now while that was off at the blasters, I fitted my replacement grommet. Then I removed the bottom bearing race, as I'll need to install a new one with a new bearing. All that was totally worth doing. Shout out to Curdford Shop Blasting in West Sussex, they've done a cracking job on this. I applied a bit of heat to the frame, and I'd had the new bearing race in the freezer overnight to help with reassembly. I used a block of wood to help keep it square as I started, then tapped it in with a hammer. I used the old race as a drift once it had got level with the frame. I kept going until I heard the dong change to a ding. Then I gave it a smear of grease. The next inevitable job was to fit the new bearing to the steering stem. I put the sealing washer on first, then packed the bearing full of grease. Then it went on. I used an aluminium tube as a drift to drive the bearing home. Much whacking later, it was finally on. Gave it a quick check to make sure it was well before feeding it up through the frame. The re-greased top bearing went on first, then the cap, and I span on the bottom nut. Now conveniently, this is where my camera cut out, but the technique to this is using the torque wrench. You apply an initial high torque to seat the bearings, and then you loosen it before applying a much lower final torque. And both specs are in the manual. Next up, the top yoke, and finally the stem nut. Now in order to get the torque on this, I needed to fit a fork through the clamps to hold the yokes in line. Well, that's the yokes and steering stem sorted. I'll come back to the bars and other bits later on, because next up I want to sort out these blue spots. I'd really hoped they just needed light refurbishment, but it turns out they needed a lot of TLC. And luckily for them, I'm a very tender, loving, caring kind of guy.
Daddy.
Piss off, I'm filming you little shit.